Evagrius said, "Cut the desire for many things out of your heart, and so prevent your mind being dispersed and your stillness lost." It could also be the motto for the global economic and environmental crisis that we've created by the rampant encouragement of desire for diverse things and for diversity itself, which robs the mind of its natural inborn stillness and capacity for processing experience and unifying ourselves with the world. Mind is naturally contemplative. You see that in children. Of course, very young children seem to operate almost entirely from the contemplative side of their brain, of the left-hand hemisphere. And of course it's necessary that the other rational and talkative and analytical side of the mind or the brain is also activated. But what seems to happen in our culture, in our way of training ourselves and forming ourselves in education, is that this other side of the brain totally predominates, at least in Western culture, so that this natural inborn contemplative side, which is our first and primary way of perceiving the world and relating to the world and dealing with ups and downs, that is relegated into what we call something recreational or unreal or illusory or narcissistic. We have all sorts of words to marginalize this contemplative side of our being. And of course, taken to an excess, as Evagrius and the Desert Fathers were very conscious, it leads to such a major imbalance that we begin to lose, our sanity. We talk about an unbalanced person as a crazy person. Well, there are degrees of balance and imbalance, and if we go beyond a certain degree, then we lose it. We're tottering, or we fall over. So, I'd like to talk about silence, because you can never say too much about silence. Well, actually, I can. Because it's perhaps what we're seeing in our culture is both scientifically and religiously, but maybe even more psychologically than religiously, we are rediscovering the necessity for silence. And we had a seminar recently, Meditatio seminar in London, on meditation and mental health, which was very interesting, stimulating encounter between religious and spiritual speakers and thinkers and professionals in the mental health field, psychiatrists and mental health workers. And there was a natural and healthy exchange of views on the common ground of awareness that meditation is a proven value in restoring and sustaining mental health, and for dealing with mental illness, that meditation is good for you. I'd just like to explore a little bit about what we mean by silence. Begin with chapter 19 of the first book of Kings. When Elijah has to go off into the wilderness and is feeling pretty low and depressed, he sits under a juniper tree and asks that he might die. "It is enough," he says. "Now, Lord, take away my life." And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, an angel touched him and said unto him, "Arise and eat." The angel came, he did. And the angel came a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too much for you." And he arose and ate and drank, and in the strength of that food went 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. And then he came to a cave. So we see the great symbols already of the journey into the wilderness, dealing with our own inner aridity, our own depression, or our own loss of hope in life, and the trek into the desert, the angelic ministrations that are there when we need them, and the food that comes to us in ways we don't expect, and then to the cave of the heart. And he lodged there. This is the King James Version review. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said unto him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah might have said, "Well, you brought me here, you should know." and anyway, Elijah reviews the reasons for his being there. So we have to tell our story. We have to understand it again. We have to tell it to someone. We have to get it out and put it in front of us. And he expresses his feeling of abandonment, his feeling of isolation and exclusion. And he said, behold, he said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. So, turbulence and the breaking up of our inner world. Okay. So, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. What happens with an earthquake? Well, buildings collapse and the ground under your feet seems to give way. So here's a multiple crisis. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. And what is the fire? Fire is what consumes what's left and doesn't leave anything untouched. So a conflagration, a breaking down, a shaking of our preconceptions, and a kind of a holocaust of our inner world and attachments and preconceptions. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And then God the Lord said unto him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. Go back to life. Go back to the work you've got to do. Go back to your responsibilities. And pick up your journey again. So we could understand this experience as an inner journey in which of turbulence and agitation, of loss, of a reformation of our mental landscape and emotional geography, and a journey or a process that begins with a question, what are you doing here? And ends with the same question. But the first formulation of the question pushes you into the process as you try to understand what you are looking for, what you're about. And we do this at different stages in our lives. We do it in crises, we do it in times of tragedy, we do it when you get married, we do it when we move into a new phase of our life or a new set of relationships. And the same question leads us back into a re-engagement and a recommitment to life. And in a sense, we could say every time we sit down to meditate, we are repeating this process. You might even say when we begin each meditation, our minds are pretty agitated. There's a strong wind, there's maybe at times an earthquake. Our minds feel very agitated, very turbulent with distractions and attachments and problems that we're dealing with. Coming on a retreat like this, we know that it takes time for the mind to calm down over a number of days, just as it takes time in each meditation for the mind to calm down after 20 minutes or 25 minutes, which is why people often say, could I just do 5 minutes of meditation? Well, 5 minutes is better than no minutes, I suppose, but it's like saying, can I cook this roast chicken in 5 minutes? Well, I don't think you can you? Maybe you can put it in a microwave, and then it doesn't taste so good, does it? And it's just the nature of things, that it takes a certain amount of time and for the mind to still and clarify. You remember the story of the Desert Father showing the glass of water. So this is what we accept. When we sit down to meditate, we are saying, I accept myself as I am at this moment in time and in this place. And part of what I am is this psychological and physical reality that is going to take 25 or 29 minutes and 59 seconds for my mind to come to any kind of quiet, and I will have the still small voice, maybe for 1 second if I'm lucky. But even if it doesn't seem as if that I am lucky, nevertheless that work of the meditation is effective and productive, is bearing fruit in our lives. So this passage, of course, was picked up by the contemplative commentators over throughout the tradition as an affirmation of the work of silence in the life of prayer and the spiritual life. That there is an encounter with God in a non-dramatizing way in the silence. I mean, earthquakes and fires and great hurricanes are very dramatic. But a quiet, calm, peaceful day is not dramatic. But there's something in the silence and in the stillness that leads us to an encounter with God of a greater clarity, a greater intimacy, and a deeper intensity. And then let's leap forward to the trial of Jesus, when Herod was interrogating him, and Herod saw Jesus. He was exceeding glad, because he wanted to see him had wanted to see him for a long time, because he'd heard many things about him, and he hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. Kind of real. What kind of person is Herod in our terms? Practical. In terms of our religious consciousness today, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad. I wanted to see you for a long time. I've heard so much about you. And could you do some miracles for me? Who is he? What's he like?
Sensation seeker.
Yeah, sensation seeker. Well, in terms of our contemporary religious supermarket, what's he like? Where does he fit?
Do tricks.
A shopper.
He's a shopper, yes, he's a child. There's something kind of innocently stupid about him, but how terrifying that he's in power.
Yeah.
You know, this man who holds the power of life and death. So he questioned him with many words. So, what kind of questions did he ask Jesus? Put yourself in Herod's shoes. Imagine you're, oh God, great, this miracles worker. This is going to be good, I guess.
How do you do the miracle?
Yeah. Okay, how do you do miracles?
Can I do it too?
Yeah, have you got some tricks you can teach me?
Can you teach me? And if you don't, I'll cut your head off.
What's that? If you don't, I'll cut your head off, yeah. Yes, you could be very ingratiating and maybe offering him bribes, offering him his life, freedom. I have a friend who's has a real gift for healing, really, and for reading, understanding the body. And I would love to know how he does it. But I know I can't ask that question, because there's no answer to that question. He just does it. And it's intuitive, it's other-centered, it's not for him. It's a gift he has and he uses for other people's benefit. And it was idle curiosity to start to unpick it. It's like Mother Julian says, we're always asking these questions and about metaphysical questions, and you go into any bookshop today, go to the mind, body, spirit, or esoteric section of the bookstore, and there'll be hundreds of books on giving you all the answers to reincarnation and what happens at death, and how to cure this and cure that. I'm sorry somebody gave me this, but I can't help but thinking of this. Somebody or other emphasizes that the best way to fulfill your aspirations is not to just think about what you want to manifest, but rather feel what it would be like if it did. To get what you want. So I'm sure that Herod is in this space. And what does Jesus say?
Nothing.
Nothing. This is the silence of Jesus. Then Herod questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. So, silence of Jesus. Saint Irenaeus says, if we cannot understand the silences of Jesus, we will not understand his words either. In our culture, silence is, especially in Western culture, we think of silence more often than not as a non-communication. You listen to the radio and there's no sound on the radio, it's broken down or batteries run out or something's gone wrong. And in a meeting, usually if there's a prolonged silence, people begin to get anxious. And we fear that silence can be a sign of hostility. We fear it because it's threatening to our sense of control or of our way of interpreting what's going on. Silence is usually seen in negative terms. But of course, and we compensate for that with small talk. Mm-hmm. We fill in any potential space of silence with small talk. Something trivial, just to make a noise, just to put words into that space. The universal symbol for silence is, imagine you were, some of you have been a teacher or a parent with a lot of noisy children running around, and you stand there trying to bring control back to the classroom, shouting at the top of your voice, "Be silent! Sit down and be silent!" And the more you shout, "Be silent," the more hysterical the children become. We can only understand silence through silence, and we are educated into silence, by people who are not frightened of it, who point us in that way, who overcome our uneasiness with silence. It's different, of course, in other cultures, although the dominant culture of our time, we call the Western culture or the media culture, is spreading this dis-ease or this fear of silence everywhere. John Cage, the experimental, I don't know what you call modern composer, is one of his most famous musical compositions is called 4 minutes 33 seconds. And it can be played with any instrument because the performer is instructed not to play the instrument. So, actually it's only given as 4 minutes 33 seconds for the purpose of programming in the concert hall. Otherwise it could last for as long as you like. And the point he's making, he's got a Zen background, the point he's making is that if the performer is not playing and there's no audible music, the audience and the performer are all listening to the silence. But the silence is not just an absence of noise, because there will be people coughing or there'll be some ambient noise. And so the music is the noise, it is the ambient noise. But it's a quieter noise than we're used to, of course, because we are listening. That everything can be music, and there is no need for a performer. That's the lesson, that's the finger on the lips trying to teach us something. that probably as children we could sense. But we live in a very noisy culture in which this intuitive understanding of silence as part of our life and part of our mental balance has been lost. Only there was a research project the EU came up with called Silence, which is a 3-year research project into the effect of noise on people, and particularly traffic noise, people living in cities. I don't really know how they come up with these statistics, but 3% of heart attacks in Germany are due to road traffic noise. I don't quite know how, but that's what they say. And I think when you come to Bear Island, one of the first things you are aware of is the reduction in noise levels, just the physical level of noise. And what effect does that have upon the mind? And upon our, especially if we're meditating in this environment. It's not that we're not using any words, or we don't hear some noise. Of course, we're not in a sensory deprivation tank. But there is a predisposition or a preparation for this deeper encounter with God in silence, because the level of physical noise and distraction has been reduced. And because most of the world's population now, for the first time in history, are living in cities, it seems all the more urgent and necessary that we practice a spirituality of silence, that we teach meditation to children, that we make silence part of our life, because it's not there naturally anymore. So we're forced by the deprivation of quiet and of preparation for silence, we're forced by that loss of silence in the environment to take on a specific practice. And I think this seems to be why meditation has broken through high levels of fear or oddness, strangeness, suspicion with which it was regarded maybe 20 years ago. Meditation is not just cool. I think people recognize now meditation is good for you, it's necessary. And the one institution of society which has been slowest to recognize this is the church, which is a little odd. I mean, it's not that it doesn't allow meditation groups to form, and there are some religious leaders who advocate it, and, as we know from Australia, teach it in the schools. But it's not exactly high on the agenda of the religious leaders in any religion, actually. And you go into most churches and you go into most centers of spirituality of any religious tradition, and silence is rare, even where you might expect to find it in Buddhist groups and others. It's quite rare. So, what's my movie? So, how do we know that the silence that we are entering is a real silence and not a self-hypnotic state, or that it's not what John Cassian calls the pax perniciosa, the pernicious peace, a kind of narcissistic, introverted state of mind, or the so-called letalis, the lethal sleep, which is where we're just drowsy, we're really just half asleep in a kind of comforting, half awake, half asleep sort of state. How do we know that the silence we are working at, silence is work of attention, how do we know it's real? Well, I think one of the ways we know that it's real is that we do experience it as work, not just as relaxation. The effect is relaxation, of course. One of the effects is relaxation. But the immediate engagement with silence is the work of attention. It's a work that can become a gift. With sufficient practice, we can experience silence continually, whatever we're doing, wherever we are, however noisy the environment. And we experience silence not, as I've been saying, just as the absence of noise. With sufficient practice, you can be silent in the noisiest urban environment or the most distracted kind of activity, or the noisiest meeting or conference. With practice, we discover that the silence is within us. It's not something we make. That may be an important difference in our approach and motivation for meditation. Are we making it? We're in charge, we know what we want, we're calling the shots, it's a technique. Or are we accepting a gift? Are we discovering something that is already present within us? So one way that we know that silence is real is that it involves work. And the other reason that we know that it's an authentic silence is that the effect is that we become not just calmer, not just clearer, but we also become more loving. Silence is the birth of love. And it's interesting how reluctant contemporary commentators can be to use this word love, despite the fact that it's such a universal need and goal and preoccupation. To understand meditation as the work of silence, in which we are receiving the gift of contemplation, is a preparation for understanding that meditation is the work of love, as our tradition tells us. The ego is diminished in the work of silence, not destroyed, but it is diminished and dwindles over time and can even be suspended for maybe short periods of time. It's not diminished by violence, but it's diminished through the work of silence, which is the work of love. One of the ways that we can see this is, in our tradition, is the way we say the mantra. The mantra is the work of silence, and in the Christian understanding, the saying of the mantra is a work of faith, a work of attention, and the work of love. And John Main describes the stages that this work will take us through. Could you just, you've got a copy of Moment of Christ there? No? Yeah. The introduction to Moment of Christ was the last thing that John Main wrote, and it's only a few pages, but in this little section he says, he distills his teaching. Let me just read it to you. I think it speaks for itself. The first requirement is that we begin to understand that we must pass beyond egoism, so that my prayer, my in inverted commas, my prayer just doesn't even become a possibility. We are summoned to see with the eyes of Christ and to love with the heart of Christ, and to respond to this summons, we must pass beyond egoism. In practical terms, this means learning to be so still and silent that we cease thinking about ourselves. So the laying aside of thoughts, which the Desert Fathers describe as the meaning of prayer, is the work we do. This is of critical importance. We must be open to the Father through Jesus, and when we are at prayer, we must become like the eye that can see, but that cannot see itself. I don't think Herod would have made much sense of that. The way we set out on this pilgrimage of other-centeredness is to recite a short phrase, a word that is commonly called today a mantra. The mantra is simply a means of turning our attention beyond ourselves, a way of unhooking us from our own thoughts and concerns. He doesn't say this is the only way to do it. He doesn't get competitive and say it's the best way. He said, this is a way, follow it if you want, and but we don't have to argue about it. What's the point in arguing about it? It's just small talk, magnified, with the volume turned up. Then he says, reciting the mantra brings us to stillness and to peace. We recite it for as long as we need to before we are caught up into the one prayer of Jesus. The general rule is that we must first learn to say it for the entire period of our meditation, each morning and each evening, and then to allow it to do its work of calming over a period of years. So again, Herod's really beginning to lose interest now, isn't he? The day will come when the mantra ceases to sound and we are lost in the eternal silence of God. The rule when this happens is not to try to possess the silence, to use it for one's own satisfaction. The clear rule is that as soon as we consciously realize that we are in this state of profound silence and begin to reflect about it, we must gently and quietly return to our mantra. Gradually, the silences become longer and we are simply absorbed in the mystery of God. The important thing is to have the courage and generosity to return to the mantra as soon as we become self-conscious of the silence. It's important not to try to invent or anticipate any of these experiences. I hope that reading these talks it will become clear that each of us is summoned to the heights of Christian prayer. Each of us is summoned to the fullness of life. What we need, however, is the humility to tread the way very faithfully over a period of years, so that the prayer of Christ may indeed be the grounding experience of our life. So I think that speaks for itself, really. We know enough about the practice of this tradition of the mantra to understand what he's saying. But just to connect it briefly to the tradition that it has come from, just think of the saying of St. Anthony of the Desert, which the Celtic monks themselves would have understood and wanted to practice. The monk, the meditator, who knows that he or she is praying is not truly praying yet. The monk or the meditator who does not know that they are praying is truly praying. That explains what John Main is saying there about returning to the mantra as soon as you realize you've stopped saying it. That's the work of the mantra, and it's the work of silence that takes us not only beyond thought, and not only to a calm mind, which he says is the preliminary process, calming the mind, but actually takes us beyond self-consciousness altogether into what we call the prayer of the mind of Christ.